Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be going over the Code with Me 3's loop in Python. Now, these are the topics that we're actually going to be covering and what it actually means and then when to use it. And we'll get to each of these items in this video. So for the first part of this, what we're actually going to be looking at is a for loop. And we know that at least with a for loop, the way that it works is it repeats often the same line of code in that for loop, however many times you'd like it to repeat. So we know in the past, when we've had some sort of variable here, we've had the variable, and let's say we want to store in a string value. In this case, we'll just store in clap. So we'll create a variable called word, and then we'll assign to it a string called clap. Now we know that if we wanted to print this multiple times to indicate that someone is clapping, we would have to print this out, over and over again. Now, this is great for just printing out maybe one or two or even three items. But if I wanted to print out multiple claps, like just to simulate someone clapping, or even if I just wanted to do it 5 times without actually writing it in this way, what we want to use is actually a for loop. So in this case here, the word is being stored the word clap is being stored in Word. So what the next thing I'm going to do is create or type in the syntax of my for loop here. Now, the syntax of a for loop is we have the for keyword, then we have some variable that is going to keep track of the values or the amount of time that we are running this code. And so in this case, I'm going to use I as that variable. Right now, it is just a variable at the present, but when we start adding in the rest of the syntax, you'll start seeing it. So the next part of this is actually using range. And what range does is it generates counting numbers. So we have our for keyword, our I variable to keep track of the values, and then we have range. Now range has a start, a stop, and a stepping portion here. So what that means is, for example, with range, by default, it starts at 0. The starting is at 0. So we don't necessarily have to place 0 first. Then we also have where by default the step is just increasing by 1. And so usually whenever you see, for example, range here, just use an example. Whenever you see range with, let's say, one value, in this case, let's go ahead and put 6 here. What it pretty much means is it's going to assign, in this case, we're using I is going to be 0 at some point, then I is going to be 1, then I is going to be 2, then I is going to be 3, then I is going to be 4, then I is going to be 5, and then I is going to be 6, but we may not actually see this because it will terminate the loop since our stopping condition is that the range of being 6. And so that's pretty much the structure of the range. But we need to finish off the syntax of a for loop. And right at the end of our for loop, we will actually see that we need to have a colon as the syntax. And then inside of here, we would indent and have your block of code here. So this is the syntax of a for loop in Python. Now that we have that understanding, let's go ahead and try to print out the word clap at least, 5 times here. So we're going to do for I, just some variable in range of. And since I know that the starting and stepping are defaulted and that the range value for stopping is not fully inclusive, I can just place 6 there. And then what I will do is put a colon there, or it is inclusive. Yeah, I'll put a colon there, and then I'm just going to do print word. And now we should see, oops, I said it was inclusive and I still kept it in. It's meant to be 5 in here because we want it to only print 5. All right, so now we have 3, 2, so we have 5 claps here. If I wanted to, I could even put 100 and it will go ahead and print that out for me 100 times. Now, for loop is really, really good for repeated tasks like this when you know that you have a stopping and a starting point, or if you have a specific way that you'd like to actually iterate through an item. You can also use lists, which we'll see later on as we go through this code with me, where we can actually do um, for I in a item or in a list. But for right now, this is just the simple syntax of printing out clap 5 times. So we're finished with this first item here. We printed out the word clap 5 times, and we could have just put clap in here as well, but this is just one way to do it. Now, the next part of this that we're actually looking at is going to be using a while loop. Now, a while loop pretty much just repeats while a condition is true. So this is more so used for input validation or repeating until a certain task is performed. So in this case here, we say that we would like to create a variable called count, and then we're going to use a while loop to print count while count is less than 4, so we have a condition. And then we need to increase count by 1 each time. And we need to ask the user for a number and keep increasing it until it becomes greater than 10. So there are 2 different tasks here. So the first one here, we're just going to set our variable count to 0. And then we're going to have a while loop. So we're going to say while count is less than 4. This is our condition. Now we're going to execute some code block. So the syntax, if you notice, of a while loop is simply just the while keyword, some condition to be met, a colon, and then some block of code. And in this case here, we're making our condition count is less than 4, and I'm just going to print out this is a loop. We are on number hashtag, and I'm just going to place count here, my variable. Right now it should say 0, but once at the bottom here, when I increase by 1, we know that that's going to be count plus equals 1, or you can have count equals count plus 1. This is just a shorthanded version. So now we increase that by 1 here. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to ask the user for a number and keep increasing it until it becomes greater than 10. What does that look like? So firstly, we have a variable, we can call it value. Then we're going to prompt the user here to enter a number between 1 and 10. And then it wants us to actually increase it until it becomes greater than 10. Now, we can do a few things here, But if you guys remember, whenever we get this input, the type of this input is going to be string because input function, the built-in function, returns the value entered by the user as a string. So that means right before this, since we are wanting to increase the value, we're going to just convert this into an integer by using the built-in function int, which is shorthand for integer. All right, so now the next thing is to ask the user for a number and keep increasing it while it becomes greater than 0. Now we can do a condition like this, where we say while true, and we can also use the if statements that we've used, that you guys kind of worked on last week. So we can say if the value is greater than 10, break. And then here, underneath the if statement, we're just going to increase the value by 1. Again, this is just going to be value equals value plus 1. Now, once we're done here, the next thing we want to do is just have our print statement here. Printing done, and then final value, and then value here. So this is one way. So we have our if statement that has a condition that checks. If so, it's going to use this break statement. Now, this break statement is one of our topics that we're going to be going through here. And this exits the loop early. So it stops it when the goal is actually met here. So we're going to say stops the loop here. Now, depending on some individuals, so this will keep on going. I'm going to go ahead and enter in 7, so we get this 3 times. So we see we enter into that loop. We enter a number between 1 and 10. And then we increase it several times until we get the value 10. And then the final value here would be 11 because, again, this still increases, and I'll show you what that means in a second. So we typed in 7, and then what will happen here is if 7 is greater than 10, since it isn't, we're going to go ahead out of this if statement and go to the value plus equals 1. Then it's going to go back up to the while loop. Is 8 greater than 10? Yes. No. So then we're going to break out of that if, or we're going to skip that if statement and then pretty much go. This would be part of that else clause if I really wanted it. It would just be else there. But just to keep it though in the process here, it's just going to skip out of that if and go straight to the value for that next added of 9. Then it's going to say if 9 is greater than 10, it's not, so it's going to increment that by 1. Then it's going to go back up to the while loop, and it's going to check. Is 10 greater than 10? It's not, because it's equal to that. So then it's going to remove from that if statement, go to the value, increase that from 1, and then go back up to the while loop. Now here, we now know that the value is 11. Now, this will still be while true. So if 11 is greater than 10, then we're going to break. And since it is, we're breaking. So once you have this break statement, it exits out of the loop. And then finally, it prints out done. Final value is 11. If we wanted to keep track of the current value so you can actually see, then we can do it like this. So now you'll see I enter in 7. And I always see it gets added each time, 8, 9, 10, and 11. And then finally, because 11 makes this condition work, it breaks out of that loop. Now, if I wanted this to work even with 10, I would say greater than or equal to 10. This is one way to do it. There's also another process when using this while true. You can use a Boolean flag, which some people actually prefer a lot better. You have is true as the variable, and then you just set that to be true, and then you just say is true here. And then before the break, you just says is true, and then you set that to false, and then you use break as well. That does pretty much the same thing that the other one does. The only difference is now you're using a Boolean variable to pretty much control. It's called a Boolean flag, but it's pretty much the same thing, just a little extra steps. So either or would work. All right. Oops. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to move on to the next item. So now we have 5.3 here. And for this one, the common understanding is pretty much just the login process here. So we keep asking the user until they enter the correct value. This is called input validation. So here we're just going to create a variable called password, and we're going to assign to it an empty string. Then afterwards, we're going to have a while loop. We're going to say while password is not equal, so we're using that not equal operator to, let's say some interesting password 1234 Python explanation point colon. Now in this case here, with our syntax being straight, we have our while keyword, we have our condition set here, and our colon. Now we need to go ahead and add the body of the code. So here, we're going to allow the user to enter in a password. So we're just going to say enter the password. Then afterwards, we're just going to print out some sort of input validation here. And I kind of sometimes like to use emojis, so I do the Windows key period symbol and just do access granted explanation point. So now when I run this here, and let's say I type in the wrong password and I just type in Python, I still get to keep on typing it out. Python J until I get the right answer. So Python explanation point. And then we see we get our access granted. So this allows us to, using the while loop, to keep on entering in or asking the user for the password until it equals this specific value here. Now we could very well have placed this in another variable and then compared that. That works perfectly fine. However, this is just for you understanding the while loop process. Now you guys will have a few opportunities throughout the course to actually work with this, especially with movie simulation, which is fine. But this is just the process of using a while loop. Now we're going to move on to the next item here. Now for this, we're going to use loops to build a total or count how many times something happens. A common pattern is total plus equal count and count plus equal 1. So the first thing we're going to do is create two variables, one called total, set that to 0, another called count, and set that to 1. And now that we have our two variables here, we're going to use a while loop to add numbers 1 through 5. And since I'm using a while loop, I'm just going to say while count, since count starts at 1, is less than or equal to 5. That way we can add each item to that. So that's going to be my condition. This while loop will keep on moving until count equals 5. And then it will terminate. Now, we're at this point where we want to read the next step just to make sure we have all the process. After the while we print, the sum is followed by the total. So I'm just going to put here block of code, and then I'm just going to also make sure that I have some sort of print here, just to make sure that I'm following through with the instructions here and not just doing my own thing. So here we have our print statement. the sum and we're using our variable total, we know that this should work. The only thing is now we need to have a code. Now, when you create a while loop and you don't have any block of code here, and then afterwards you have some sort of statement, it'll run through with an error like this because there's nothing in the middle. So you can either choose to just type in some keyword pass, and we'll get into this, or even just print some value. But in this case, I'm just going to do pass, and we'll get to that later. But for right now, we know what we want to enter into our while loop. We want to add count to total, and then we want to increase count by 1. So the first thing we're going to do is have our total plus equals count. So we're adding count to total. So the first round, 1 will be added to total. And then the next round, 2 will be added. And then continue on after that, or whatever is in there. Now, for us, we also want to increase count because this is running with our condition. We're going to increase count to 1. Each time this while loop is ran, it's going to increase count by 1 until it reaches 5. Each time it's going to increase whatever value is in total until this value, and then we'll just see the final print. Now we see the sum is 15, which makes sense because the original thing is count 1. Then we're adding 1 and 2. Then we're adding 2 to 3. Then we're adding 3 to 3. Then we're adding other items. So we can go ahead and actually print out current total, comma total. And we'll see it display out. So we have 1, 3, then 6, then 10, then 15. And that's just because that's how much we're adding into total. Each time we add in a value, it should be 3, then 6, then 10, then 15 getting added in there. So that is what this specific task was asking us to do. We've used count and we move on. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Now, the next thing we're going to actually look at is 5.5 here. Now, this one is fairly simple since we've already gone through the first part of understanding for loops, and the next few might be simple. However, try your hand at this. So we're using a for loop here. So we know we have the syntax to print and loop number, and the current number is from 0 to 4. So if we want to use 0 to 4, we know that we have to have our for keyword. We have to have I, in this case, to keep track of the values, and we're going to use our range function. And we know that with range, we have a starting and stepping that are default. So if starting by default is 0, we don't need to place that in there. So we can only just place the stopping, which is 5. And in this case, we know that 5 is not inclusive. So we know it's going to go from 0 to 4 if I place 5 in there. So that's how I know those numbers will work well. So we have for I, but we're missing something. We need to indicate what is I associated to. So we're going to say for I in the range of 0 to 4. And we know that the stepping by default is by 1. So now let's go ahead and print this out. We're going to print out the loop number. Then we're going to place I here. Now that we have this here, we should see the number 0 to 4 get displayed out just by using our range loop from 0 to 4 here. Now that's all that this specific question was asking us to do. It's just to recall what you learned earlier. So hopefully you were able to code this easily without even like the video portion. Now the next part of this is actually using our counting, and we're using range even more so. So we want the range to produce 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and it stops before 6. Using this, when you want counting to start at 1, is you would put 1 first and then have 6 be the not conclusive part. So in this case, this is just to help you understand the range sequence or the sequences of the range function. So hopefully you're able to go ahead and try to work on this yourself, but we'll have for I in range, and we're going to put 1 first, then 6. Then afterwards, we're just going to print out I here. And so this is going to print out 1 through 5 because the 5 is not inclusive, and we're telling it instead of your default 0, we want you to start at 1. But we do want to use our default stepping of 1. And so now we see the values of 1 through 5 here. I'd highly urge you to play around with this built-in function because once you start understanding the mechanisms, it makes your life a whole lot easier when coding, especially for any specific uh, scenario. So in this next um, task here, we're going to be using both a for loop and a while loop to accomplish similar things, but the for loop is going to go from 0 to 2, and the while loop is going to count down from 3 to 1, so it's kind of in reverse. So pause the video and see if you can do this for loop without actually looking at the answers to see if you understand. But I'm going to go ahead and get started. So we have for I in a range of 3. And then I'm just going to print out here for iteration, colon, I. And then lastly here, because I know that this should just play out 0, 1, 2, which it does, good. Now I want to get to the while loop. Now with the while loop, I'm going to set a value to be 3 so that we can start with that value in the condition. And then I'm going to use my while keyword, x is greater than 0. That means here I'm just going to print out some information saying while iteration, colon, comma I. And then instead of us, because we don't have some sort of built-in incrementing here, we're just going to have to decrement by 1. And the decrement is just -1. And remember, the increment is adding 1. So in this case here, we're just going to do x minus equals 1 here. And this will make sure that we decrease this x value by 1 each time. Oops. And made a mistake here by adding an I instead of x. You just want to make sure you keep the variables the same. Now it should work. So we have 3, 2, and 1 here. So now we have our increment for loop and our decrement for a while loop. All right. So hopefully both of these structures kind of help you understand it a little bit better. And now we're going to get into our nested loop. Now, this nested loop comes very, very handy with a lot of different things that we'll get through. And I will show you guys this here in a moment. Yeah, I'll show you guys here in a moment what it all should actually look like. But for right now, I'm just going to start with a quick example using a grid so you can actually see it. All right, so now for this one, we're going to use a nested for loop to print rows and column pairs for a 3x3 grid. So in this case, what we're actually going to do, and I'm going to show you how we can go about doing this. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to have some sort of value that we can actually see in grid form a little bit easier. So I'm going to go ahead and do a little emoji, and I'll just do, I don't know, some flower. Okay. Now with this, I'm just going to store this into some variable here, store that string there. And then I'm just going to have a outer for loop. So with a nested for loop, these go through 2D lists and they go through different processes to iterate through a structure. And you'll see that here in a moment once we just get the emoji out. And I'll just show you the list in a second. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to have our first for loop, which is considered the outer for loop. Too many T's there. And this is just going to control, oops, the rows. So we're going to have 4 row in range, and we're just going to make sure it's a 3 by 3 grid. And then we're just going to have our inner for loop here be for column in range of 3. And this will form our other 3 by 3 grid. All right. And then the next thing that we're actually going to look at is just printing out some form of value here. So I'm going to go ahead and do print, and we're just going to have the emoji here, comma, I'm going to use end so that it keeps the emoji on the same line until we move out of that inner for loop, and we're just going to print a new line to get our grid base look. Now this is us creating a grid of emoji art, but we could already have a 2D list, which we'll get into later. But this is our 3 by 3 grid if we wanted to use this to pretty much create a 3 by 3 grid here. So let me know what you think of this specific process. But this is just one way to pretty much create a grid. Now, the next way for us to actually do this, and I'm just going to quickly show you, is actually just creating a grid. So we're just going to have a grid here, and we're going to use a 2D list. Now, for the first one, we'll just plop in here this emoji. Oops, gotta close this. Comma. And then we would probably want to do this, and we'll probably get in there like some sort of other item. We'll put robot, and then we'll make our next grid. Okay, and then I'm just gonna go ahead and add in a few more, and then I'll just make it on the new line here. So we have this, close this up, new one, open quotes, separated by commas, and then another quote. And we'll separate this one. Okay. So now this is actually a grid, a 2D grid here of, in this case, the structure will help you probably understand it better. Column 0, column 1, column 2, and then over here is row 0, row 1, row 2. Okay, so now when we want to display this out in a nested for loop way, we have for row in grid. So now we're saying we want it to be inside of that grid, the outer. For column in grid, or for column in row rather, because we're just picking this specific row and we're looking at the columns in it. And then afterwards, we're just going to print out each column, have our end and our space, and then we're going to just print here. And finally here we have our grid, and I'm going to go ahead and just make sure we have our next print here to separate the two grids. So yeah, this would be taking our 2D grid and displaying it out. So this is two ways to do it, but let's go ahead and do it exactly the way that the task asks us to do. So I'm just going to say additional examples here that you can always come back to. And for this very one here, for the simple example, because we want to display out the rows and column, we're just going to do for row in range 3, for column in range 3. Then we're going to print, and we're going to use our format printing here, F string colon, open close curly braces for the placeholder for row, comma, col, and then open close curly braces for column. And then we display that. And then you'll see here we have the row 0, column 0, row 0, column 1, row 0, column 2, and it repeats up until 3. So that is pretty much how it's structured, just like this, just like that. So these are the different examples that you can always look back at and refer to. This one pretty much creates its own grid. This one uses a 2D list. And then displays it out here. And so hopefully you understand the beautiful use of a for loop and how it can be used for any sort of like program that we have later on, depending on the criteria, obviously. But the next thing we're going to look at is this variable, and hopefully from seeing this 2D grid example with the emojis, that hopefully you'll be able to see how this simple one would work. But we're just going to create a list called items. And the list structure, open, close square brackets. We know that it's going to have apple, a banana, and a carrot. And then afterwards here, we need to use a loop to print each item on its own line. So there's a difference whenever it specifies on its own line versus on the same line. We use this end here to print out all of the column items on the same line. And then we have our end, which allows for us to have a space like so in between each of the items. And then we have our print to make it onto a new line and then repeat the same step. But for this one, we just want to print it on the same line. So we're just going to use a simple print. So we're going to have for item in items. So items is the name of the list, item is the name of the variable. You could very well have I if you'd like as well. But it's always with practice to keep it similar to the items that are in your list so you understand what you're iterating or going through. And iterating is just a terminology to indicate that we're going to traverse or go through this list here, each item at a time. The next thing we're going to do is just print out item here, which is the variable item, not the list. And now we see each item gets its own line by printing it out just like so. All right. So now that we are done with this portion here, we want to move on to 5.10 and really get a good understanding of these break or these statements here that we're going to get into break and continue. Now, if you remember at the very top, there is a loop quick reference that you can always check. But for break, we used it earlier. It exits a loop early. So that means it stops when your goal is met. And then for continue, it skips one iteration. That means it ignores, for example, you can use continue to ignore bad input if you would like. It's not always required, but it is one option to use. So we're going to go ahead and try our hand at this code here. So the very first thing we want to use is we're going to write a for loop from 0 to 4. We've already done that before, so it should be fairly easy. Then we're going to check to see if the value is 3, then we're going to break. Otherwise, we're going to print break and the number. So in this case here, what we're going to do is we already have our for loop. We're going to do for I in range of 5 being our stopping limit, and it's also inclusive. Then we're going to say if I is equivalent to 3 here, then we're going to want to break, which just means to stop or terminate loop. And we've used the break before in the while loop. This would be the first time you see it done here, at least in a for loop. So now that we have our if I is equivalent to break, underneath that if statement, we're going to have our print, and we're just going to display out break, comma, I. All right, and let's go ahead and run this for the very first one. So we see that we have break where it's 0, 1, and 2. So it does display this, but as soon as I equals 3, we break out of it, and it does not even go up to the range of 5. So we can use break statements to stop a for loop and to only make sure that it reaches a condition. Now let's go ahead and work on using our continue statement. So we're going to use print and then type in continue. And then for this one, I'm going to use my for loop, and I'm going to say for I in range of 5. Then we're going to say if I is equivalent to 2, right? Because the value has to be 2. So if I is equivalent to 2, then we're going to type in continue. And if you remember what I said, continue skips an iteration, and that's it. So you continue, and then we're going to print I. Oops. So now you see for this one, because we use continue, it prints out 0, 1, and 3, and 4, but it skips 2, which is why this continue is good. If you want to, for example, skip some sort of item if a condition is met and move on to the next. So this is also very conducive if you want to use it in a while loop, or in this case, even in a for loop and an if statement. So continue is a really good statement, as well as a jump statement, as well as break. So hopefully you guys have a good understanding so far of break and continue. If you don't, feel free to let me know. And the next thing that we're actually going to be looking at is just the loops as well. So we're going to be using loops with else clause. And so a loop uses else when we only want to run a specific task if the loop finishes without actually specifically hitting anything. So if a break happens, the else block does not actually run. So in this case, we are not going to see it run if we had a break here. But since we don't here, it should run. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to run a for loop that prints 0, 1, and 2. So that means that our range is only going to stop at 3. I'm going to say for I in range 3, and then we're just going to print out I here. Then on a new line underneath our for loop, we're going to display else, and we're just going to print here a message that says loop finished without break. You'll see what I mean. It does 0, 1, 2, and then finally after this for loop is ran completed, then it runs that else statement. All right. So I hope that that process kind of helped. Now, for example, if I put a break here, we may not see a 0, 1, 2 loop finished without a break. In fact, we may only just see 0 because we don't even have a condition in there, but we know that the else will not even display. So this is a way for you to actually use the else clause if you would like to kind of, display out any message whatsoever after a loop is finished and you don't have a break statement in your for loop. That's when you'd want to use it. Now, the next thing we're actually going to go through is what does enumerate do? And this one is a newer one. Haven't really introduced it as much of late, but it's a really good one. Now, enumerate is a built-in function. Oh, shoot. Yes, there we go. Shoot. Okay, this works now. Okay. So enumerate is a built-in function that lets you loop through something and then keep track of it by an index position at the same time. And it does return a tuple. But the difference here is that enumerate is not a tuple itself. It is a built-in function. But just under the hood, it just pairs each item with a specific number. And so we're going to kind of try to use our flower example here to better understand enumerate. All right. So in this case here, I'm going to go ahead and just take one of the rows of this. Take this one. Copy. And I'm going to go all the way down here to enumerate. Now, I'm just going to have a list called flowers. And then here, we normally would use a for loop just to iterate through each flower. So, normal for loop. This would be for flower in flowers, print flower. So we know that this is just the normal for loop. It prints a flower each time. We only get the actual items. But if we also want the position of where the items are, that's where we want to use enumerate. So in this case here, we're going to say for index, or we can even have I, comma, value, or we can even just have value flower, but I'm going to have value here in enumerate. And then here is where I would put the list of flowers, or the list name flowers. Then what I'm going to do is print the index and the value that is associated to that specific flower. And then we'll run it. All right. And so now we see we have the index or the position of the flower and the actual item. So when would this or why does this even matter? You'll know exactly where each item is. So if you had a 2D list like we had above, you'll know where each item is associated. So let me go ahead and try my hand at that. I'm going to go ahead and just copy this grid, the full grid. And I'm just going to go ahead and paste it below here. And then I'm going to just copy this for loop with the enumerate and remove flowers and instead put grid. And the thing with this that we're going to have to add for a 2D list though is we have for index, we want to just put R for a row, or you could just put the full row index. And then instead of value, we're just going to put row. So for row index with the row item here in the enumerate grade, and then we're going to say for call index in, and we're going to put emoji here as the object or the variable that we're keeping track of in enumerate, and we're going to pass in row here. Then here is where we're just going to print, and we're going to print formatted. And inside of here, I'm just going to put row, open, close, curly braces, row underscore index, comma, call, open, close, curly braces, call underscore index. And then here, I'm just going to place a little symbol and then place in here the emoji so we can actually see the value. And then we see here, we have row 0, column 0, 1, 2, and then it points directly at the emoji associated. So if at any point in time you don't quite also remember how or where each of these are in terms of the column versus row, or you don't understand the position, you can always use this built-in enumerate function, and that will show you the position as well as the actual value itself. So in this case, we know that enumerate is not a data structure, but it is a built-in function that temporarily will create numbers, pairs, while we're looping. So you could kind of think of this as attaching a number for each of these specific items to our item here in a loop. It is not a tuple data structure, but it does return values in a tuple form. So an index with a position. It returns tuples, but it's not a tuple itself. So I hope that this helps you kind of understand enumerate is temporary. It only exists while the loop is occurring. And it just is a machine that temporarily labels things as they pass by. So in this case, it's just adding in the location of each emoji as it passes by. So I hope that that helps you understand what what enumerate is. Another quick example that I'll show you will be up here using our simple for loop. Since we do have a list here, we could just create a variable here and we can call it pairs. And we can actually convert this list by using enumerate here of flowers. We're going to have our pairs together and then convert that to a list. And then this is where you'll actually just see the relationship or how it looks like the pairs together. See where it's at. So this is what I mean by it's stored kind of, it returns it as a tuple with an index. Open, close curly braces, 0 with that, 1 with this, and 2 with this. So that way you can kind of see what it looks like. Okay. So I hope that this helped you understand Enumerate. It's very beneficial in a lot of cases. But in this case here, we want to go ahead and create. Let me go ahead and plop this down. Additional examples. This one, we're going to want to create a list of fruits. So we're going to say fruits equals, and we have apple, pineapple, yuzu, and orange. All right. And then we want to use enumerate to print each of the fruit with its number starting at 1. And so how we go about doing that is we'll go ahead and have our for loop for I fruit in enumerate. We're going to put fruits first in this parentheses. And then we're just going to indicate that we actually want it to start at 1. And then we're going to print out I, comma, fruit here. And then we have 1 to 4. So this is nice. Enumerate is a very nice structure. All right. So now we're going to want to move on to another task here. Um, all right, we're going to move on to 5.13, which is using additional practice with our random module. So we haven't really gotten into modules, but you guys have used random before in the first few weeks. I kind of exposed you to pretty much a little bit of everything that we'll be going through this semester, so that it's not super overwhelming for you as we go through this process. But at the very top here, we have import random, which we're using a random module. And in this case, this random module, we can access built-in functions with this random module. And you will have a Zybook about modules later, but a module in Python is a file that pretty much contains pre-written code that you can use, which is why we can use our built-in random functions. It pretty much gives you the tools to generate different types of random numbers and random choices instead of kind of writing them out with your own logic yourself. So in this case here, we're actually wanting to use um, our randint function, which just gives us a random integer between 1 and 6 in this case, and it does include both. So some possible outcomes would be 1 through 6, any of those items here. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to first create our for loop. So we have our import module, and we want to roll a die 10 times using a for loop. So we're going to say for I in range of 10. Then here we're going to have some variable roll, and we're just going to say random.randint 1, comma 6. Now this 1, comma 6 is just going to randomly give some sort of value to roll, and then we're just going to print roll, comma, or colon, close, comma, roll here. So it loads this import random, loads the random module so you can use it. The for loop loops, runs it 10 times. The roll is what's storing our randomly generated numbers between 1 and 6, and then we finally display it out. So what we see here is 10 times where we have the numbers 1, 2, 4, 6, and 5, but we don't see 3 anywhere here. So we are missing quite a few numbers, but this is just how the random generator works. So this is pretty much what this task is asking us to do, is use a for loop to kind of randomly generate um, 10 different roll numbers. All right. So hopefully you guys are good up to this point. The next part of this is actually something that you guys can use for your project integration in the future, whether it be project one or other projects. In this case here, you're going to be using a for loop to show options. And then we're also going to be using a while loop to keep asking the user to choose a valid option. And so for this one, we're just going to create a list of foods. The apple, banana, and carrots. All right. And then we want to use the for loop to iterate through this to show the options. So we're just going to say for food, in food, print, available, food. Okay, so now we see the available food here is apple, banana, and carrot. So we used our for loop for that. Now, the next part of this is we need to use our while loop to ask the user what to feed the pet until they enter a valid option. If valid, then we're going to print that the pet eats happily. If not valid, we're going to tell them to try again. So how do we go about doing that? Now we can do different ways. We can use our Boolean flag, which is more than likely what we're going to use here, where we're going to set a value to either true or false and use that in our while loop. So I'm going to create a variable called fed first, and I'm going to set that to false. Then I'm going to have my while loop, and I'm going to use my not operator. So while not fed, while not fed. So this would be while true, essentially, the opposite of false. Then the next thing I need to do is ask the user what they would like to feed the pet. So I'm just going to create a variable here for the user to enter in their information. I'm going to use the input built-in function here and say, what will you feed your pet? Apple slash banana slash carrot, colon. And for this one, I want to control their input because all of mine are all lowercase. So I'm just going to go ahead and do lower here. Now that I have this, the next process of this is me using my if-else if statement to check the choice that the user picked is inside of the food and to be able to display two different messages. So we're going to say if choice in foods here, which is the list, if choice in foods, then we're just going to print out your pet eats the, comma, choice, comma, happily. And then we're going to set fed to be true. We're going to assign to fed true to stop our loop. But we also need to check if it's not a valid option. So we're going to want to do else. And we're going to print out that food is not available. Try again. All right, so in this case here, if I just type in kiwi, it says the food is not available. Try again. What will you feed your pet? So it redoes it again until I say something like apple. And then as soon as I say apple, it checks is apple in foods. It is. So then it sets this to true and it will break out of this loop, or should. That's the logic here. Yep. So your pet eats the apple happily, and that's what gets displayed out. So here you're using a while loop, and here you're using a for loop. Okay. Now the next thing we're gonna move on to um, is actually working on the second project integration solution. All right. So this one is just the adventure report practice project. This one, pretty much, you're gonna use continue to skip bad or empty input. You're gonna use break so that you can stop early when a valid choice is made, and you're gonna use the loop else so it can handle the case where no valid choice was entered after all the attempts. Now, this one is really going to take everything that you just learned and put it in one. So I'd highly recommend you trying, except for obviously a few items like enumerate, try your hand at this before you actually see the solution. And this will help you know if you understood it correctly or not. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to create a valid list of places. So I'm just going to call this choices, and I'm just going to have this be the forest, river, mountain. All right. So now we want to give the user 3 attempts. So in this case, we know that attempts is going to be 3 attempts. We could use a for loop or a while loop. In this case, I'm just going to use a for loop. So I'm going to say for attempt, that's going to be the variable I'm going to keep a track of, in range of 3. So we've got that attempt part yet. Now we want to say, we want to ask the user where they will go with their pet. So in this case here, I'm going to create a variable called place, and I'm just going to have my input built-in function and then say, where will you, or where will your pet go, question mark, open, close parentheses, and I'm just going to put forest, river, mountain, colon. And again, for this, because I do want to control the input of the user, and with the places, they could type in a lot of different places. I'm going to just use strip to strip out any blank spaces and dot lower to make sure that it's all in lowercase. All right. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I want to check if there's not a place, then I'm going to use the continue. So if nothing was entered, I'm going to say if not place, then we're going to print a message saying skipping empty choice, dot, dot, dot. Then we're just going to put our continue here. Now, the next thing we want to do is if they do enter a valid place, then we want to print a successful message and then break. So what condition would this be? If place in choices, print, and we're going to use our format print here, your pet explores the place, explanation point. Then we want to have our break statement, terminate loop. All right, and then finally we want to have our else statement here, still inside of our if. So this is invalid message here. If they didn't place anything, it's going to skip. If they did, And then we have else. And here we're just going to print if they didn't actually have any sort of valid choice. So say that's not a valid choice. Try again. All right. And then lastly, it asks us to have an else clause associated with our loop. So if the loop ends without a valid choice, we're going to use an else to print that the pet stays home. So here we're just going to place else, and then we're just going to print out no valid choices given, the pet stays home. Now, this gives us really good understanding of our breaks, our continues, even our condition using a for loop for just having 3 attempts. Before, I believe we've done this with login, but now we're doing it with a for loop. And so now hopefully you kind of have a better understanding of how to use these different connections like branching, membership, looping, else statements, and lists. So the next part of this is just an independent final task. This one is just introducing functions a little bit to you. It is not something that you will um, be getting any bad grade for. It pretty much just is a structure that I'm going to go through and show you here. Now, in Python, it's all lovely and dandy to have all of our code just like this. And if, for example, we were using it in Visual Studio Code, it would just, again, run from top to bottom. But in Python, we have things called, or something called a function. And with a function, it's just a group of collected statements together that are going to be executed when it's called. So in this case here, when it asks us to write a main function, define a function named main. What this actually means is we're wanting to have a function that we can reuse over and over again. It's a great way for us to reuse a block of code to perform even a specific task. So in this case here, for the very first one, we write a function, define a function named main. So in this case here, we're going to go down to this main function. How we define a function, some of the syntax here is we use our def keyword and then the name of function, open close parentheses, the parameter list, and then we have our colon at the end and then our block of code that can be reused. So in this case here, we define main. It calls all of these prints here. So welcome to Loop Practice Lab here. And then what it does, if you remember when I talked about code, how it runs from top to bottom, it works well like that. But in this case, if we've already defined these functions all the way at the top here, and inside of the main, since this is going to be the function that we call, just stick with me here, what happens here is I'm going to call print numbers first, which is at the very top, but at the present, that's not the first thing that will get called main will. And that's because we use this if name equivalence main here. So this is something that we'll get into a little bit more when we get to the code with me with functions. But this is an attribute that's associated to the main function, and this actually allows us to, if you, for example, had code in a separate file and you wanted to import it, you can indicate whether you want to start at a specific function or not. And in this case, we're saying we want to check to see if the specific attribute is named main, then that's the one that we want to kind of run. So in this case, we're saying we want to run the main function. And so it's going to look for the main function, which is here at line 80, and run from top to bottom all this code, so calling all of these functions here. It's a lot cleaner and a lot easier to manage your code when we separate them into functions and having them each do one specific task. But we will get to that in the code with me. This is just helping you understand looping, but also introducing you to tiny things that we will be doing this week or next week. All right. So in this case here, we want to just print out numbers. So let's go to number one. We've already got this together. Now we want to print out numbers 1 through 5 using a for loop. And then we're going to iterate through a list of fruits and print each one. So we can pretty much take the information that we had above and modify it for our for loop here. So first things first, we'll get rid of pass. And this one just wants us to display out printing a number from 1 to 5. So we're going to do for I in range 1 to 6, because 6 is not inclusive. Then we're going to print out I. So when we run this, what we'll see is in main it says, welcome to the loop practice. We print out 1 through 5, loop practice complete. But that's just for the very first item that we have here. So here I'm just going to put a print statement. I'm just going to say in print underscore numbers. All right. Okay, so now the next thing we're going to be looking at is printing out fruit. So we're going to get rid of the pass. And again, you'll see the nice functionality of pass is it allows us to run code even if we don't have code within that specific function. So here I'm just going to have fruit equals, so we're going to have our list here. Apple, banana, cherry. All right. So now how do we loop? Which loop would we use to loop through this list? We know that the for loop, we can just do for fruit in fruit and then print out each fruit. Okay, great. And then lastly here we have our print. So let's go ahead and run this and see how it looks. Okay, so we have our in print numbers 1 through 5, good. In print fruits, apple, banana, cherry. Okay, great. So now go ahead and we'll fill out the rest of these to your best ability if you remember how for loops work, especially as it gets to modification of information. Try your best, pause the video, and then play it when you are actually ready to see how it's worked. All right, I'm going to go ahead and continue on from here. So now that we've done function A and B, let's go ahead and do function C. Ask the user for a number, then print it multiplication table. Now between 1 and 10. All right. So we're going to go ahead and do this. First things first, print statement. I'm going to say in multiplication table, open, close parentheses. So we have our print here. All right. Now inside of here, first thing, we want to ask the user for a number. So I'm going to create a variable num, use input, ask the user, enter a number. And since I want to manipulate this number to give multiplication, I'm going to do what? I got to convert the input to an integer. So I'm going to cast it as an int. All right. So now that I have that integer value, the next thing I want to do is just use my for loop. For I in range of 1 through 11 here. We know that it's not inclusive, so it's 1 through 10. Then here, I'm just going to use my format printing. And I'm just going to say num, which is the variable or the value that the user entered in. And we're going to have times, which is the x, I equals num times I here. All right. So this will give us our multiplication table based off of what the user displayed out. All right, let's run this and see what we need to do. So I'm going to do my favorite number 4, and let's see. We have our multiplication table here. So we see this worked well, and now you hopefully are starting to see the benefit of having for loops and also while loops, as well as structuring it with functions. So hopefully, if you are actually starting your project and you're like, ooh, functions are way better, I'm going to use that, feel free to do it. And then if you run into any issues, any of us, myself and also the TAs, would be happy to help you. All right. Now we're going to move on from the multiplication to while loop functions. Here's where things will get a bit interesting. All right. So we're going to do a countdown. So we're going to count down from 5 to 1 using a while loop, then print blast off. Then we're going to have our password authentication using a while loop. Keep asking until correct. All right, let's go ahead and do this. So we're going to go ahead and print in countdown. All right. And then inside of this here, we're going to just have a starting at 5. So our number is going to be 5. And then we'll have a while loop here, n is greater than or equal to 1. And then I'm just going to print out n each time. So at the present, it's just going to print out 5. Then I'm going to decrement n by 1. So minus equals 1. And then afterwards, still a line underneath the while loop, I'm just going to print blast off, because once we end, or once it finishes with that last item, the last thing we should see once this condition is exited is blast off. So hopefully you understood this process a bit. You don't have to have the exact same number. Oh, you do, actually. It needs to be 5. But you can play around with it if you understood the full mechanism of it. Let's run it. We got our 4 here. All right. Now let's see. The next one we got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, blast off. All right. So we now see we do have our while loop. Now the next thing is our password authentication. All right, so inside of this here, what we want to do is create the correct variable. This is what I meant by we can store this into some sort of value. So the user's password, we have Python 123. We're storing that into our variable correct. Then we're going to have the password be an empty string, meaning this is what we're going to try to compare that item with. So while, and this is hard code, while password is not equal to correct, which we know it's not, then here we're going to have password equal, and we're going to get the input from the user asking them, enter password. And then lastly, outside of that while loop, if they got it right, then we're just going to print a string here, access granted. All right. And then run. Make sure we get our, we'll just do a different number, 5. All right. And then password. So let's go ahead. Python 122. Still didn't work. Okay. Python 123. All right. That should have worked well. Now we see access granted, and we see the other time that we entered in information. So we are done with the password authentication part. Again, please do not change the name of these functions. Just remove pass and add in the code because it makes going through this a bit easier to understand what you don't and what you do understand. All right, so then we have print here, and we're just going to say in print underscore table here, and then we're just going to print out that new line. And for the print table, what we're wanting to do is a nested for loop to print a table of rows and columns. So what we will do is here we're just going to have our for row in range 3. And if you wanted to do it with a grid, that's also perfectly fine as well. Then we have for column in range 1 through 6. And then we're just going to print out the column and end here with a new line or a space between each item. And then we're going to place a print here. And now we see we do have a printed table of a 3 by 5 item here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1, 1, 1, 2, column 3, 4, and 5 here. All right. Now, the next thing we are going to actually modify is going to be print star grid. So we're going to go ahead and print underscore star underscore grid. Put in. All right. So for this one, we just want to print a nested loop to print 5 by 5 grid of stars. So in this case here, what I'm going to do is here, this is another option, like I mentioned earlier in class, not necessarily in this code with me, but when we went through this, you don't necessarily have to have a variable in your for loop, but you can use the ranged value to be able to get the items or the number range that you'd like. So instead, what you would do is do an underscore here to indicate you're not going to be using that, and then you would just have in range of 5 here. You could still have your I, but you're not using an I, so it would just make more sense to keep it simple and have that underscore there. But in this case here, just like we have done in the past, where we've had some string and then we want to multiply it by a certain value, we would do in this case times 5. But in this case, because you want to change it up, you would just do times 5 here. All right, and so here we see we have a grid of 5 by 5, but let's say you want to use that variable in this item. I think for this we just want that 5 by 5, but I'm going to go ahead and plop this down. So if we use I here instead, we can use I, and it will actually give us a really nice design. Let me go ahead and print this out to give any line. Okay. And finally here, this is the alternative. If we use I, it starts at 1, goes to 2, 3, then 4. If we use just the 5 value, it just runs through it. So either or, depending on what you want, work. But I believe this one already does what we will be doing later on. So, all right. So now we're actually wanting to, since we've already done our kind of our function introduction, for loop, while loop, nested for loop, nested loops, we want to get into applying loops to real world examples. So we're going to create two lists, days of the week and task for each day. And then we're going to use a loop to print each day with its task. And then finally, you're going to ask the user for a triangle size. Use a for loop to print a right triangle using asterisks. Row 1 has 1, row 2 has 2, and so on, which you kind of already saw earlier. But here below has kind of an example of what I just went through with you. So I'd highly recommend you try your hand at this and play around with this now that we've already kind of gone through that already. All right, so now for the real world examples. So for this next step here, we are actually just going to have our weekly tasks. So we're going to have days of the week here in a list. And we're just going to put Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And then we're going to have tasks. And we're just going to set up math, science, English, history, and review. So we have two different lists here, one for days and one for tasks. Now the next thing we want to do is have a for loop. And we can actually use, since they both have the same length, one of their lengths. So we'll do for I in range of, and we'll just do the length function, which is this. You can always reference this back to our first code with me where we use length, and even the first few weeks where I had you guys use all of these different mini built-in functions. But we're going to get the length of the days, and we're going to have the colon here. All right, now the next part of this, in this for loop here, we're actually going to use our print format printing. So we're going to have our open close days, I, oops, and then colon, there we go. And make sure, because I'm not, days, open close, scroll back, okay. All right. So we have open close curly braces, tasks, I, and then this is pretty much going to use a for loop to iterate through this list here. So let's go ahead and get this working. 1, 2, 3. All right, and we scroll down and we see here we have Monday with math, Tuesday with science, Wednesday with English, Thursday with history, and Friday with review. So this is also one way to use a for loop to pretty much group items together in a task and days of the week. As you can see, there are different ways that we could do this. It kind of looks like a dictionary, a key value pair. But if, for example, you were trying to use this as an inventory for a game, you could always display it based off of the score or whatever information you have available in your program. But this is just using a for loop. All right. And then lastly, we're going to look at the final challenge here. So we're printing out triangles. This is the very last thing. So we're actually going to take this from the user as opposed to hard coding the value. So we're going to say size, and we're going to ask the user to enter in a triangle size. And since we know that we're going to be multiplying this, since we know that we're actually going to be using our expression part to duplicate values, we're just going to cast this as an integer because we know we need it as an integer. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to have our for loop, for row in range, and we're actually going to start with 1 because, again, the instructions want 1x, 1 star. And then we're going to go to size minus 1. And that's because since we are starting at 1, let's say the user entered in 10. We know originally with range, when we use this and we put 10 here, it starts at 0 by default, goes to 10, and then steps over to 1, which means it goes from the range of values is from 0 to 9, not including or not inclusive of 10. So it's not including 10. So in this case, if we're wanting to start at 1, and we're wanting to go up to 10 minus 1, aka 9 here, then we also know that it's going to step over by 1 here. And the values here are just going to be 1, 2, 9. All right, so in that case here, we know inside of this for loop here, if we want to actually print it out with the specific value, we want to make sure we first have the asterisk, the image that we want to multiply. Then we're going to use our multiplication symbol and then just say by row. All right. And so with this, oops, uh, we are actually going to run this. Let's go ahead, run it. And we got the 4 here, enter. Python 1, 2, 3, enter. All right. Now here we want our triangle size. So I'm going to go ahead again and just do 7. And then we see here we have our right triangle goes from 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 here. And so that would be this information here. That's all that this was pretty much asking us to do for the code with me. And then finally, we come down here and everything's kind of already grouped together. We have loop practice complete. So these are all of the final tasks. There is nothing else there that we kind of want to add in except for maybe just a reminder that we want to print that we are actually in print underscore triangle function. And then just have a new print here. Okay. And finally, this will be my last run through this. And we see just this whole entire process. So this is great. We now have all of our information correct, except for this one. Just want to print that we are in weekly underscore task. Oh shoot. Okay, this one shoot. All right, good, good. This one's works. Print. All right, run for Python 123, and then the size. There we go, 10. There we go. So now everything is in the right format that we would like, and we do have all of our outputs here from the loop practice as well. So this is all that this assignment was kind of asking for. I hope that the introduction, a little tiny bit to loops, will kind of help demystify the thought process of loops, especially as we get into it and we start learning about returns and passing in values. But for right now, this is just going over while loops. It's just going over for loops. It's going over continue and break. And so I'd highly recommend you reference this code with me as much as possible as you go through your coding process and just kind of play around and understand these concepts as well. Anyways, I hope that this video was helpful to you. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know, and I'd be happy to go through any of the items with you as well. You take care and have a wonderful rest of your day.